Hi, welcome to the XY Chromies, Confidently Uncertain, a show where two Army vets turned renewable energy engineers discuss veteran issues, science, geopolitics, and everything in between. I'm your host, Pearson Guest, and I'm joined by my co-host, Richard Ellis, where today we talk about veteran isolation, and then we'll be evaluating myth, propaganda, and extraordinary claims, and pseudoscience, and much more. But first, let's cover some good news. In a world dominated by sensational doom and gloom news, we felt like it would be nice to start each show and each week off covering good news story and sharing our thoughts. So with that, I would normally go to Richard, but I have the good news segment for today, and so I want to talk about net neutrality being restored. Um, so, Richard, today we're going to talk a little bit about net neutrality. How are you doing today, anyways, by the way?
I'm doing pretty good. Had myself a nice big lunch, so I'm nice and sleepy and logy.
Perfect,
So
perfect.
I'm gonna really bring
To
the energy
record.
tonight.
That's right, and I'm drinking some highly caffeinated tea to make sure I keep myself up through the afternoon recording. So, we're going to talk about net neutrality first. I'd like to explain what it is really quickly. Um, Net neutrality is the principle that internet service providers, or ISPs, should treat all internet traffic equally. This means that they shouldn't be able to block access to certain websites or services, slow down specific types of content, also known as like throttling or choking, and then charge extra for accessing certain content or services. Um, so a little brief background onto what happened with net neutrality recently. It was repealed back in 2017 under Anjit Pai's leadership. He was positioned as the FCC chairman, appointed by Trump, and he was set to repeal net neutrality regulations, arguing that such rules stifled investment and were based on hypothetical harms rather than actual anti-competitive behavior. Um, During this period, there was extremely controversial public commenting period. The FCC's proposal to repeal net neutrality rules drew an unprecedented response. They allowed an open forum for public commenting, and during that, there was 21.9 million comments, which was pretty insane. It was later found that the majority of these were fraudulent or duplicated or botted comments. So there's some nefarious acting happening there. Uh, Despite the controversy and public and expert criticism, they decided to repeal net neutrality. Ajit Pai was an executive for AT&T before this, so take with that what you will. Anyways, following that, in 2024, just last month, the FCC voted to restore net neutrality by reclassifying broadband as a Title II telecommunications service. This ensures the internet remains open and fair without rate regulation and unbundling. And this enhances oversight and security measures. The new rule empowers the FCC to prevent ISPs from engaging in harmful practices like throttling and paid prioritization. So, just quickly on that, what Comcast and other large internet providers would do, they'd be throttling certain services that used a lot of bandwidth, like Netflix and streaming services, Twitch, all video games, things like that. They would throttle this or require paid prioritization from these software services, which would of course trickle down to the consumer and make them have to pay more. Um, and then they get an active role in internet service outages. The FCC actively monitors and addresses internet outages and ensures essential services such as teleworking and online learning and digital marketing are consistently accessible. So overall, that's what restoring net neutrality uh, has done so far. What do you think about that, Rich?
There's a history of this country of laws that go into effect or are repealed that have unintended consequences that are associated with their whatever the change is made. And I don't know to what extent the discourse of the internet has become worse because of net neutrality's repeal. But when you take into aggregate um, the way that the public uses that resource and the way that um, interested parties in manipulating it could have their effect on it because of that law being repealed. I can't imagine it was not without its, you know, downsides. And to the extent that we have maybe better, uh, I might be twisting the definition around in my mind, but maybe better regulation over something that is not being um, controlled by special interests. That's
Yeah.
always going to be a win for the public.
Yeah, when it was being repealed, there was a lot of large internet providers who were really looking forward to having, finding ways to
Mm-hmm.
charge people, and we've seen recently there's been news stories about Wendy's and certain fast food chains talking about charging surge pricing, and surge pricing
Yeah.
is becoming a new type of capitalist. What I guess evolution in little capitalism and taking more money based on like interesting supply demand metrics. Versus, I could see the net neutrality being repealed if it hadn't been reversed like it just recently was. The surge pricing was going to be inevitable if it wasn't already starting to take place by these large internet providers, of course. Because of that, things like this, I think like one of the follow-on effects that might be interesting is what this will do to internet infrastructure. I know that right now we are upgrading, more of the rural areas with fiber optics and, laying down high-speed internet cables to the point where like there's probably smaller mid-sized towns who have way better internet than I do down here in
Mm-hmm.
the Bay Area, where laying a mile of fiber optic cable underground could cost, $10 million per mile or something crazy like that. Ridiculous. So, yeah, down here we actually have pretty crappy internet, even though there's quite a bit of it being used in the Bay Area and Silicon Valley. So, uh, just an interesting thought on the follow-on effects to this re this repeal. So,
There's an idea that's I'd like to bring to the discussion with regard to surge pricing and using what we call those supply demand curves that are kind of instantaneous in the market. So this idea that you could have a good of some kind that is that uh, its popularity for whatever reason, because it's the time of day or because it's the time of year, it suddenly skyrockets, and a lot of people are accessing that resource or requesting it. And of course, the role of economic systems is rationing. So an economic system that has a surplus of something, it's the rate of rationing is low because people aren't using it. But then the inverse is true. If it has a small amount of something that's in high demand, the rationing is very high because um, prices on that good will rise commensurate with its demand. So this is Econ 101 stuff. There's a case to be made in scenarios like, for example, let's say you have a lot of traffic going into a city for morning rush hour and a lot of traffic coming out of the city for evening rush hour. There's a case to be made for changing the price of tolls in and out of the city for those rush hour times and using that as a mechanism to either fundraise to improve the transportation situation
yeah,
or using it as a way to change people's behavior so that they will self-select a lower price good or a lower price time, and then they will kind of fix the problem of that availability of the roads or the availability of uh, transportation mechanisms and so forth.
yeah,
So these are a surge price is not a terrible idea in some applications.
yeah,
What's interesting about where it begins to be a problem is when it's for a inelastic good. And the quick definition of an inelastic good is something that you really can't go a day without. And we could make the obvious case that that's food. And
yeah,
food is an inelastic good. There's people around the country and maybe around the world who have done a wonderful job of stockpiling food, and so therefore a instantaneous price change is going to affect them because they're a connoisseur of meals ready to eat. their,
Yeah,
their stock of canned corn is unparalleled. And the same can be said for energy. So food and energy kind of are their own idea of the economy because of um, the central role they play in human industry and life.
true.
And so if you start putting these surge pricings on inelastic goods, you can ration them that way, but that's also wrought with some terrible consequences if you don't have alternatives to offer people during those surge times. Now, in the case of a fast food restaurant using a surge pricing to sell a popular and in demand product during the hours of 11:30 and 1:30, well, they might actually drive away some customers if perhaps a cheeseburger is now $25.
I was just thinking about that. I was like, well, if I'm Mickey D's, maybe I'm going from a different angle, right? Where I'm like
Yeah,
offering a discount during that period of time, like an anti-surge
totally.
pricing, and then watch, we'll just see how the capitalist engine,
Yeah.
basically, yeah, it's like it's almost as though, capitalism is it's constantly, performing its own little experiments, you know, uh,
Hmm.
a lot, a lot of times at the you know, to the detriment of the consumer,
Hmm.
or the investor. I mean, Wendy's could be making some terrible decisions, right? And McDonald's will show them why it's terrible, and it could have
Right.
far-reaching implications. I have to say that in the Bay Area, I can't imagine in Santa Clara the Wendy's implementing surge pricing because that place looks dead all the time I drive by it. Whereas if you went to In-N-Out, yeah, surge pricing it almost makes sense to just deal with the traffic jam that the El Camino uh In-N-Out burger, like it causes traffic on that street, the longest highway in
Yeah.
the country, and there's tons of, like it literally causes backup of traffic around the side into a different street and everything. So them implementing surge pricing actually makes sense just to to tame the logistical nightmare that it causes for people going to get lunch every day. Um, I will
Yeah.
say that In-N-Out also employs like an army of teenagers, unlike most of these places, and it's pretty amazing. There's a ton of people working in that building to produce those burgers as fast as possible. So,
Hmm.
uh, but yeah, surge pricing. It's an interesting experiment in terms of uh, capitalism, you know. Hopefully democracy will be able to counterbalance it as it should. The democratic engine of our government, I feel like a strong government is there to help keep capitalism in check. And I'm sure uh, Joey B is working on something right away.
So there was a sort of in our background conversation there is a little bit about I think economics and so forth, and I was interested to kind of bring that into the foreground to talk about the unintended consequences of choices that we make as policymakers or as administrators or given some type of role to participate in the rationing of anything. And I mean that's we don't really think of our government as being a rationing organization, but it's one of them. It's one of the features of government is to create situations where um, durable, or excuse me, not durable, but inelastic things are not ex- as exploitable as they might otherwise be in a free market economy. And that these are lessons that humanity has learned over and over again, and each time we invent a new system of law and a new economic system and a new place or a new community grows from an old one, we always have to retry these experiments over and over again. And sometimes it didn't work in the past, but now it's working because there's some new element that makes a difference. And we're living in a time now where the availability of energy and the currencies of energy are more abundant, especially in the United States, than they've ever been in human history. And so we have a skewed idea of what things are actually inelastic and important for survival and things that are conveniences, but we nonetheless treat them as though they are critical for survival.
If I yes, and if I may add, you know, I mean, definitely to yes and that, we also have a greater energy demand than we've ever had before, which is
Yeah.
it's right there. I mean, the supply and the access to energy is, once again, it's like, oh, you think we'd have an oversupply? We don't. We're like we're right there. And one of my favorite geopolitical analysts, Peter Zion, who you and I are both aware of. Um, he says some pretty hyperbolic things. I
Mm-hmm.
don't when he does talk about the energy demand and the industrial plant needing to double in the next 10 years in America, that I think is where he is pretty on the money. I don't know if double's the right, whatever. He says he's done the maths on it. And his assessment on renewable energy is iffy, I feel like, but on the demand side, I think he's right on the money. When he talks about the industrial plant. I mean, we see this happening right now with the new deals with Mexico and Canada in terms of manufacturing. The
Mm-hmm.
CHIPS Act specifically, like already the country has distributed $38 billion of funds to 15 different major chip manufacturers in the US who are already ponying up about $327 billion in infrastructure. Even Intel, I think, is $38 billion to be spent in Portland by uh, 2035 is the date I believe that they were going for. So they have an aggressive plan. $38 billion of investment into Portland infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that's an insane influx of money and resources and in jobs right there, and jobs that are tech jobs. They're high paying jobs. They require technical expertise. Imagine the schools right there who can benefit from and who need to basically, it's a reason for them all to level up their electrical engineering
Yeah.
programs, their computer software programs. Anyways, I could ramble on, but that's just one industry. Foxconn right now, out of Taiwan, is going into agreement with the US right now as we speak that 20% of their chips will be manufactured in the US going forward for 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a bilateral agreement with Mexico and Canada because they're to do the medium to low end chip manufacturing on the Mexican side, and then they'll do the high end chip manufacturing on the US side. So it's a multilateral, multi country agreement that's going to spur industrial growth in all three of the countries, and all because, frankly, a different country didn't play very nice the last 60 years of investment that they got from the West. Now, due to bots, attacks, and the fact that our channel is 1.5 podcasts old, I'm not going to mention that country yet. But uh, someone could surmise that it's like, I don't know, the second biggest country, largest GDP in the world. It's the second biggest country in the world as far as population. And you can make another couple. I'll give another couple of Easter eggs. I guess that should be enough to talk about. So, anyways, all is to say is that energy demand is crazy. We have tons. Like, that's just one industry that I can quote right now, but there's plenty of others that we could look at. And yeah, it just means that the energy demand is going to rise really high. The labor demand is going to continue to be high. If I had to guess, the inflation might be around for quite some time, but that's due to large amounts of growth. Hopefully, wages grow with that inflation.
Yeah. Our future looks promising, but that doesn't mean there isn't going to be some bumps and bruises along the way. And there's enough stories in our history where we've done similar things under even worse strain or worse existential threat. And this time around, we're going to have one of those sort of like the mid-century build outs of infrastructure and modernization And we're going to do it without the baby boomers. They're going to be home with their feet up and complaining about you millenniums and how you're not working hard enough like they did.
Yes, yes, they do like to project, don't they? And they do like to gaslight us. It's like their favorite pastime. Thanks, thanks, mom and dad. No, I'm joking. My mom doesn't gaslight me. Um, yes, yes, the boomers aren't going to be there to do it. You know, they're once again going to receive a nice, shiny, new, upgraded country from somebody
Yep,
else. What a
that's
surprise!
right.
It's almost as if history is a wheel. Shout out to
Yeah.
Fourth Turning, Neil Howe, and William Strauss. Great book. Just want to shout that out. That's the reference I'm referencing right there, if anybody knows. Um, yeah, so I think now's as good a time as any to jump into the veteran portion where we talk about isolation because, yeah, I think that's a good topic.
So in the broad scope of veterans health, it's veterans health is on the one hand not any different from anyone else's health outcomes. On the other hand, there are some particular parts about it that get into maybe more severe corners, and that has a lot to do with our mental health. And I want to start off by saying that I I like to talk openly about the project of my mental health as a vet, and I try not to get too in the tall weeds and get into too many specific details, but it's important to me to, when I have the forum, to normalize it so that when other vets hear me talk about it, they know at least there's one person who is clearly oversharing for a thing that they might themselves really not feel comfortable talking about because it has that nice Venn diagram of being stigmatized and that their insecurities about other things also connect with it as well. So,
I'm,
veteran
I,
health.
oh, sorry, I was going to add that obviously, since we've talked about it a lot, I
Mhm.
also like to do that, and my veteran friends,
Yeah.
who I talk to regularly, we all, it's there tends, I mean, I do. It's rare that I meet vets within my circle, at least, who don't mind talking about their mental health. To be honest,
Hmm.
it's something about um, the aftermath of getting out. Maybe people realize this while they're in, but I think
Yeah.
a lot of vets, they're not oblivious to the fact that they probably have some serious trauma. um, and um, so many of the ones I do talk to feel that way also. So there is it's surprisingly, I really want to get into isolation because it surprises me because I felt of openness to want to talk to other vets about this and
Hmm.
kind of sought them out eventually to talk about this as my buddies, and kind of just started asking them questions, and lo and behold, started to become very surprised and then also, fascinated by each of their answers when we talked about each other's childhood. And the fact that we were all
Yeah.
really good friends and like got our asses kicked in the army together, and I didn't know shit about their childhoods, or we didn't really, we
Hmm.
just only knew the surface. And um, so yeah, I'm sorry to derail there, but I just wanted to put those 2 cents in.
Well, no, I appreciate it, and our conversations are the kind where a contribution tends to take it maybe in a different direction than I was intending, but I think that you gave me something to really build off of there. There's this is an expansive topic, and I'm not going to explore the entire thing today. But what I want to get at is this idea that um, there's a couple of working definitions of trauma and what it means to be diagnosed with PTSD. But essentially, it means that uh, in a moment of intense experience, what what our body and brain are trying to do is keep us alive. And so there are these adaptive behaviors, and I'll list them off for the audience. You've heard of the one: flight,
Yes.
fight, and freeze. We've all heard of those ones. And there's a fourth one that the author Pete Walker talks about in his book on complex PTSD. So fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. And our brain uses those strategies to survive intense situations. And what trauma is, in one of its definitions, is that we tried to use one of those and it didn't work. Maybe we tried to use several of them and they didn't work. But nonetheless, we still survived the situation. It's just that what's left is our brain trying to recapitulate that failure of those survival systems to keep us safe as opposed to just alive afterwards. And so those survival systems get activated pretty early in our lives, depending on what type of family system we come from. And in the anecdotal sampling that I've been making as I talk to other vets, what I'm the the conclusion I'm arriving at is that there is some significant percentage of enlisted veterans and veterans who were enlisted people, so they entered the military as a junior, the lowest grade, so a private E1 like myself, and that 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 I was going to say the word cadre, but that's not the right terminology. That cohort is the word I was looking for. That
Yeah.
cohort of us, the the Venn diagram of complex childhood trauma and then later PTSD is just almost a complete circle. There's some outliers. There's going to be people who had, what they would call secure attached families and they're well adjusted and they join the military and extraordinary things happen to them and they have PTSD. But generally speaking, we're arriving on our first day of boot camp with a pretty activated limbic system for our survival behaviors.
Yes. And to add to that, so I joined as an 18 X-ray, which is a loaded MOS to join. For people to understand, the 18 X-ray program, I believe, was started in the 80s. Uh, Sorry, Special Forces guys, for me butchering your history right here. But the X-ray program was designed to, in layman's terms, take a Joe off the streets and within
Mm-hmm.
a year and a half time ish to 2.5 years, train them to go from a civilian to a special forces operator.
Yeah.
Um, and so this idea has always caused a lot of friction, although 70-ish% of the special forces entire like in its entirety are x-rays at this point. But
Yeah.
I'll tell you right now, they fucking hate x-rays. uh, the special forces has a huge disdain for them when you're in there. Maybe it's built into being part of the hazing process or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
um, a lot of it has to probably do with the fact that if you're not in the X-rays, the pipeline to become special forces requires a heavy lift to go from a regular Army unit. So when you're in your normal
Mm-hmm.
unit, in your normal MOS, if you're not infantry, there's even more loopholes you have to go through because you have to basically
Yeah.
become an infantry soldier or get some kind of bypass. I don't know though, don't quote me on the route. It's always changing, but essentially you have to change your army job, and then put in a packet. You have to get approvals from your commanders and base and CEOs and all this stuff. And all these people can shut these packages down. These packages can be rejected. And so some guys spend years trying to do this because this is their dream. They might be a cook or whatever, and
Mm-hmm.
they're like, hey, I don't want to do this shitty job. I want to go do what those cool guys with the beards and all that stuff are doing. Um, and they go through this whole process. All of that is to say, um, it causes a lot of friction between the people who seemingly just get to go in right from the street and get this job. And no less, they usually get a bonus for a signing bonus, if they complete and all these other things. So there's a lot of friction there. Anyways, I was an X-ray, and one thing I will say about the enlisted who join as X-rays is there might be a larger sample size of the relatively non-traumatized individuals who are joining. And specifically in my company, there were, I want to say it was like over 10 guys who were D1 college football athletes, guys who
Mm-hmm.
were like about to be semi-pro or failed, like went to combines to try and make it pro, maybe could have played
Right.
in Canada. Some of them came from Northwestern. They were like 3.8 college students who, I mean, I called one of them. he'll know who he is. I won't name drop him, but I called him Captain America in basic training. He was like 6'2", Northwestern safety, 3.8, smart, could run faster than me, but was bigger and stronger and
Hmm.
every, like he was just like the
Hmm.
package, right? Even looking back in my memory to imagine if he had trauma, it was very, I would have said very little. And there was a lot of really high functioning super HUA guys who joined that company specifically.
Well, you've
Um,
you've laid out a really
so
important idea by describing that, Pierce,
yeah,
which is that we will sometime we'll get into the tall weeds of selection bias, and that is when you have a elite organization like Special Forces, and then you set up the entry filters as they have done, then what they get is this really interesting subset of people who are different, and maybe it's spin the wheel and you get something different every rotation, but you get a different subset of people who are coming in directly from the civilian population, and then you're going to get a different subset of people who are coming in from the already serving military population. And of course, there's going to be conflicting interactions between those two groups, and it's because of the selection process that got them there in the first place.
yeah,
And the Special Forces is very specifically trying to make it difficult to get in if you're already serving, because that's the type of person that they want, the person who has the wherewithal to get there after going through all of these crucibles to get there in the first place. It
yes.
really means the performance that they're going to get out of that service member is intensely greater than if it was just a walk in the park to get into it.
Yeah,
And
selection is called 2 weeks in hell for a reason, but it's also,
mhm,
as they'll tell you,
mhm,
the interview. That's the
yeah,
interview. And if you're an
yeah,
X-ray, you go through pre-selection, which is your
mhm.
first. I mean, you have a lot of interviews if you're an X-ray, actually. You have a couple, like, and the attrition rate is high for the X-ray program, but I think it's like you said, it's
Yeah,
by design. You get rid of people in basic. There were a lot of X-rays who came to basic. They were not in shape.
yeah,
I was not in great shape, but these guys might not have ever done athletics in their entire life kind of shape. And
yeah.
some recruiter was like, you can be special forces. And they got to believing it after playing Call of Duty or something like that. And they showed up. And, the first basic training shark attack, a shark attack is where I don't even know if it's legal anymore, but an infantry basic, it still was at the time, where a bunch of drill sergeants, the first day you get out of this bus and you're all lined up, and the drill sergeants all come out and they start smoking you, which, if you don't know what that is, that's making you do push ups, sit ups, and all kinds of other workouts to physically stress you out.
Hmm.
Smoking means it's beyond the point of that burning sensation in your arms or legs, and so you are smoked, like you're burnt, your muscles are burnt out. I don't know if that's the best explanation for it, but anyways, so a bunch of drill sergeants will come out, they'll surround you, and they'll smoke you. They'll yell at you, and a shark attack is where they all find basically it's just like a predator prey model in the wild. Like, they find the weakest joes as quickly as possible, the one who's not doing push-ups after like 10. He just started getting smoked, and they all attack the weak gazelle or the old
Hmm.
gazelle or the young. It's not pretty. um, so that got rid of a couple X-rays right away. The X-rays, of course,
Hmm.
were some of the softest minds there as well. I would say it weirdly, when they, at the recruitment process brings in all types. Um, the softest and the hardest individuals might go for the X-ray, as far as the infantry enlisted potentially. And the ones who start to make it through different echelons of interviews, as
Yeah,
we'll call them, usually all possess a couple traits that are all the same, even though they could be completely different. I would say I was on
right,
the don't quit trait. Like, I just
right.
was stubborn and wouldn't quit things. Eventually, I did get quitted out. I hit my threshold, but I was able to make through, a good amount of portions. But there's a lot of other guys who are on the opposite side who are like, not only don't quit, but they're like, I will win. I will win against
Yeah,
this. And that would be more like the Captain America type that I was mentioning. He was like, he was there quitting. Pff, that's not even an option. I'm here to win. Like, there's guys there who are there to beat Special Forces cadre in marches and stuff, and they're really
Hmm.
badass. And I'm sure they're doing really amazing things for our country right now. Those guys, I'm very happy that they made it. Um, but yeah, so it's an interesting, it's a wide spectrum at first. They cast a wide net, and you watch as
Yep.
each echelon of interview kind of really reduces the net there. But it's definitely interesting to think about that. So,
So to your point, what I wanted to build on that is that you described a scenario of what we would call allopathic load.
okay,
And that is to say that the allopathic load is the more technical description of what stress is. And so
okay,
when our allopathic load is high, um, we're our body and brain can actually perform really well for a short amount of time. And I think I'm not going to go into what is the the biologic state of being under allopathic load right now. But let's just say that in those conditions, the human body is activated by hormones and the chemicals that our pituitary system, excuse me, our endocrine system creates. And it's when we talk about the different structures going on here, I'm sort of getting into the tall weeds about what it means to, so a definition of trauma, definition of stress, and when these conditions are prolonged, when they're lengthened, when they happen continuously over a long period of time. And I don't have the I don't have the diagnostic book in front of me for what how the VA makes the diagnosis for PTSD, but there's a subset of features of it. And to to get into one of the subsets that's important to our topic today, which is this the way that veterans tend to isolate, it's this idea that as a consequence of the formative years and a consequence of what we endured while we were serving, the way that our neurologic system is set up, it's highly sensitive to threat neuroception triggers. And so what you see in many veterans with all the different portrayals of post-traumatic stress um, and the disorders that it causes is that we seem to have a short fuse. And what what the helping professions for as therapists and psychiatrists have begun to use is a thing called the window of tolerance. And so we can think of the window of tolerance as being this range in which we can handle, disappointments or handle interruptions or handle maybe a crying baby or
tolerate
we can
bullshit. Yeah, I mean, tolerate the bullshit of life. Yes, yeah.
yeah,
I'm
right? All the things
smiling
that life throws
because
at us.
I agree. As someone who can easily have a short fuse, as you know, you actually had to rein me in
Yeah.
yesterday, and I was like, yeah, yeah. And I was like, okay, okay,
Well,
calm down.
we shouldn't go into that too deep, but I appreciate that you were receptive to me asking you to be gentle in that situation. And
I
maybe
respect you. I respect you. So of course,
and,
like
and
it overrode my need to get all attack doggy and get all nerdy too at the same time. Because I'm like a nerd attack dog. I'll start like pulling receipts and be like, well, what is this? What what was this? What is this all
right.
about? Because this is But anyways, like that's just a funny inside joke for us. But yeah,
Hopefully we're giving the public an aspirational friendship to work towards. One where we work in tandem to either escalate or attenuate each other.
yes, yes.
So I'm talking about the window of tolerance, and this is one of the early um, ideas that I began to wrestle with in my I'll call it a therapy, my trauma recovery project with therapy. And it's when I learned about the window of tolerance. And so the window of tolerance is this range of mood or affect between hypo agitation and hyper agitation. or arousal. The arousal is the other word, hypoarousal or hyperarousal. Hypo being low and hyper being high. And so with vets, depending on where they're at with the severity of their trauma and how they're dealing with it and what coping skills they actually have, their window of tolerance may be very narrow. And so we can find ourselves in this hypo situation where we're not very responsive in our family systems. You you can't really get a response out of us if we're, do you want dinner? I don't know, I don't care, that kind of thing. And very quickly flip the bit right into hyper agitated and create all kinds of mayhem and carnage in that state. Because of course now kids are getting yelled at, spouses are getting yelled at,
I've got a
people are
great
getting
story about this. Actually, I think it
people are getting
hits.
people are getting aggressed on the street and so forth. And so
So,
let me hand it off to you here in a
yeah.
second. But I just want to reinforce that those two extremes are really hard to live with. And so that's the setup for what I'm going to get into next. Pierce, go ahead, take it away.
So to build off that, I can use a personal story. So the first thought I had about this was this tolerance band, and something about being in the military for a long time. I think that band is either deadened or desensitized potentially, or
Yeah.
even it is widened, but by not your own, by like the force and the weight of the beat down that the military has,
Mm-hmm.
ultimately done to you. Uh, you know, and I'm being a little bit hyperbolic. The military didn't destroy me. But you know, any other vet can kind of understand. Like, and many other vets probably had way harder beat down than I did. Let's be real. So, but during that, I feel like maybe your band is, it's artificially been widened. Um, and when I got out of the army, I think that very much changes your bandwidth almost immediately because you you feel switch flips. You're like, well, shit, I don't have to answer to people that can put me in jail for not listening to them. At the end of the day, it comes down to like that. Um, and I think that causes an immediate where I was very open to non-military, like the band was very open to non-military experiences, and I was very open and loving towards all the new friends and people I was meeting back in Portland, and I was like, totally going on my hippie journey in Costa Rica for a couple of months, and but even when I was in Costa Rica and I was that guy walking around with a sarong and no shirt, just loving the sun, enjoying every day and partying with a bunch of friends, there were certain times where we were in hyper stressful situations because we were in Costa Rica and, there are and where you had a couple girls saying, getting involved with potential transactional deals that they shouldn't be there for, and then, making a
Mm-hmm.
fuss. And I like lost my lid a couple times during this period of time. And my band was just it was so tight. Like I could literally go from like, hey, I'm the happy guy, but like, hey, this shit is stressful all of a sudden. I was like, everyone shut the fuck up. Like there's serious shit happening right now. Um, you know, there's literally, yeah, we're in a different country. And I just remember thinking about like now that I think about this band of tolerance and like how tight it was when I got out, really. I would say tight is the word I can best describe it, and how much it's loosened up over the last 8 years, that I've been on my own little journey since then. So, anyways, that's my little ad about that. um,
So there's a sidecar idea with the the concept of the window of tolerance. I hold my hands apart like this to show the public
yeah.
that I'm showing you know a place where you can be a little jagged in there and kind of stay cool with everybody. But there's this adjunct idea which is called response flexibility. And what
Mm,
happens to vets is our response flexibility it's truncated. And an ideal response flexibility range would be unaffected, okay, noticing, and somewhere in the next, 3 or 4 steps, there's the ability to negotiate terms. And it escalates and escalates and escalates, and then somewhere at the very end of that spectrum, where you've done had all these pro-social or socially accepted means to de-escalate. Now it's the level of violence that's needed. That's response flexibility. And in
Okay.
veterans, because as a consequence of our experiences and the consequence of our highly activated limbic system and so on and so forth, well, our response flexibility is truncated. And so what we lose is that middle band where we do a bunch of pro-social repair and negotiating and attenuating the situation.
Yeah.
And so we might be really sitting quietly in a corner, and the novelty picture that everyone knows about is a loud noise goes off. And then now it's game on because we're activated into hyper agitated mode or hyper aroused mode. The 4th of July is not a fun time for a lot of dogs, and this is where dogs and I agree because it's not a fun time for me either, and it's usually because all that noise and commotion is really attacking that just so tenuous grasp I have on being tolerant to a lot of stressors.
Yeah.
Well, now that we have some terminology here, we have some terminology for trauma, and that is that despite your best efforts, your protective and survival mechanisms really didn't get the job done, and you still experienced something pretty terrifying. You were in fear for your life and safety, but you survived it. So now your body and brain, and I want to stress that it's both things, are continuing to adjudicate that and continuing to use that as um, the measure for safety. And that means that the world is a less safe place to you. And so more things seem like much more existentially hazardous. And the next thing we talked about is this idea of the response flexibility, but that as an adjunct to the window of tolerance, and whether or not we vacillate quickly between hypo and hyper agitation.
So,
So,
oh, I'm sorry. I wanted to mention that it's funny. I think we're going to talk a lot about the limbic system and the prefrontal cortex
mhm,
throughout this. Like
mhm.
basically, um, which is funny because as an engineer, it's not necessarily my wheelhouse, but I know that's something that you've studied extensively over the last couple of years as you've studied yourself and your own
Yeah.
experience and logged experience from vets. Um, but our conversations have definitely rubbed off on me. And I recently, when you're talking about this regulation, I recently was talking to another a service person who's in still, and they get really fired up about all kinds of news articles, that are
Mhm.
really inflaming or whatever. I mean, they're news articles, and the thought I had when I was talking to them, because they were like, "Why aren't you so upset? Why aren't you mad at this? Like, why aren't you up in arms? Why aren't more people talking
Yeah.
about this?" And it was an article talking about the EPA was going to have had a ruling coming up on a certain number of chemicals that would be allowed to fertilize or clean or do something to crops
Right.
of celery and some other stuff, and how these chemicals were really bad for you, and the EPA before had ruled favorably in the past towards big agriculture, which would be allowing these chemicals to exist. And so that was the article. It's set up. That's the premise of the article.
Mhm.
Um, and I read it, and then I read the headline, and I go, "Oh, this is, it's inflammatory." And then I read what the article had to say, and I started to become less inflamed. All right, but I didn't get too inflamed in the initial onset like my friend did. And the first thoughts I had was, if our limbic system is this raw fight or flight, hey dog, type of a governing system that basically has us have like knee-jerk reactions, and it also
Mhm.
is tied to the way we emotionally react to things, like
Mhm.
initially sometimes.
Mhm.
And I thought, most of these headlines are have figured out how to activate parts of our limbic system or the emotional ties to our limbic system.
Yeah.
And the way that I've governed those gut reactions, especially after the 2020 election, I had to, like recalibrate because I was getting fired up from every news story. You're just following the polls and, oh, somebody's polling high this month and then next month it's the opposite. And this would happen over and
Yeah.
over again. I'm fired up. I'm right there with it the whole time. Like my whole life depends on it. When really, like me, I knew who I was going to vote for. I don't need to track the polls every month to go, will they, won't they? I'm just firing myself up. And this article, when I read it, I was like, well, they haven't, it's concerning, but the EPA hasn't ruled on it yet. And so, like, I can't get fired up about something that hasn't happened just because their past happened. I started thinking about it. I was like, well, who was in the head of the EPA when they ruled favorably when big ag, right? Like, there's a lot of nuance to these stories sometimes. And if you do think about this, which means you're activating your prefrontal cortex or your reasoning machine up here, the
Yeah.
most modern part of our brain, it's there to govern our limbic system in the first place. And what you're talking about is through trauma, something has been broken. And I would argue most likely not irreversibly irrevocably broken because we have
Hmm.
this great brain elasticity, which
Hmm.
we can't go into right now, but I'm sure you will talk about at some point during our
Hmm.
podcast. But the ability for our brain to recover from trauma and actually learn and
Hmm.
grow and heal itself. Um, but anyways, I digress. The prefrontal cortex, by reading and reasoning through the article, I was able to not allow my limbic system to let my emotions really get a hold of me and make
Right.
me get crazy about an article that wasn't worth getting crazy about, right? And so I just wanted to touch on that because I thought it was pertinent to what you're talking about as far as this limbic system and this bandwidth that you're given to
Yeah.
govern, and how over even the last 8 years, I've watched mine go from very tight to looser and wider and more attenuated to fit what I would say like a normal bandwidth might be, or even, so I thought that was pertinent to this conversation.
Yeah. And I think that I am going to elaborate on the structures of the brain that are, let's just put it this way, I'm not a neuroscientist, I'm a layperson, so I'm going to relate topics about the areas of the brain that are really interesting to me currently because of the role that they play in the um, allopathic load or allopathic stasis. Allopathic stasis is the ideal situation to be in. That's where your body's functions and systems are operating at the lowest of intensity, but the optimum for life. And when we talk about limbic system and what its purpose is in the brain, and we talk about the prefrontal cortex, yeah, these are kind of big terminologies, and maybe our audience is new to these topics, and I'll elaborate on them more. But one of the great ways to think about, I'll circle back around to our topic, which is isolation, pretty soon. Um, One of the ways to broadly think of the way that the brain works is that the limbic system handles immediate action. The limbic system is very tuned into making black and white judgments. If I've started saying to people, don't give your limbic system a puzzle that needs nuance or gradation. Give it black and white problems.
Zeros and ones.
And zeros and ones, exactly. If you are scanning your environment and you see a buff colored rock, well, the limbic system that's dialed into these things will take that buff colored rock to be a lion and then respond accordingly with one of those fight, flight, freeze, or fawn features. And if it turns out not to be a lion, you lost nothing. You flinched. But if it turned out to be a lion, of course, then maybe you acted just in time with one of those survival strategies, and well, your genes made it into the next generation. The prefrontal cortex is another major area of the brain, and it's called prefrontal because it's in the forehead, it's in the front of our brain. So injuries to the front of our brain can affect how it works. But in social in okay, so I was going to say social human interactions, but the definition for me of being human is being social. That's our stock and trade. It's what we do the best. It's why we're a successful uh, of the most successful hominin
Yeah.
family. Our prefrontal cortex is a mediating structure. In other words, it regulates other parts of the brain. It has some control over other parts of the brain. It mediates internally, and in its most idealized application, it can mediate externally. So not only can you regulate your internal homeostasis or allostasis, maybe that's a better terminology here, your allostatic load and allostasis. Not only can you regulate that, under ideal circumstances, we can also do that for other people. This is the big
Yeah.
idea that I wanted to work to with isolation. And it's hard. You in our example earlier where you wanted to go on the attack and I made the effort to stay your hand, you allowed me to do that because we trust each other.
Yeah.
And that's really important in human interactions and relationships. We obviously can be terrible to each other. It's done all the time. So this idea of trust is huge in that external regulation. If you're a parent, if you have children, your prefrontal cortex is the dominant feature in an interaction between you and your children. They don't have a fully developed brain in that way. And so it is through your influence and your attachment to those children that you're able to help them regulate themselves. And in family systems like the one that I came from, it was poorly performed. And it set me up for a life of suffering as a consequence. These days, because I know these things about how our brain works, I've of course worked on it quite a bit. And one of the most important things that came out of the counseling and came out of the literature that I've read on this topic is that it is through the intersubjective human experience that nervous systems change other nervous systems. And so the trap that veterans get into, and way more often than I would hope, is that because of the difficulty in dealing with us, we can be hard because one minute we're not really that involved, and the next minute, we're pretty radically involved. We begin to isolate because we don't want to hurt other people. It's not a thing that we feel good about. And that might mean at first that maybe we don't spend much time around our friends. Maybe begin to back away from them. And we certainly cut out acquaintances and strangers. We have nothing to do with them. And then friends, and then there would be certain parts of the family that we stop interacting with because they activate those survival strategies. Let
Oh.
me tell you that when they say that it's easy for your folks to push your buttons, it's because they made them. Well, that's a very nice metaphor for what actually happened. They literally created the sensitivities in us that they can activate. And
Yeah.
so the next thing you know, now you're not talking to your parents. And pretty soon, if you have a spouse, she's going to grow tired of this. And it's not going to be long before she's gone.
Yeah.
And so the next thing you know, we have pushed everyone out of our way and out of our lives. And without an intervention of some kind, we'll get it down to where we're basically living in a cabin by ourselves
Yeah.
and living off our meager pension. And this is no way to live. It's alien to the human experience and human health. And so I'm talking about this here because it's not because I want to go on some national campaign and rescue all veterans from the dark corners and get them back out into the world again. That's impossible. But I'm talking about this because if we know that there is not a slippery slope, but a trend, this is a trend in our data set, then we can consider before getting farther along that trend where it's too difficult to come back, things that we can do differently. And I will take
Yes.
this moment to talk about some of those things that we can do. And Pierce, I notice we're running up against the clock here, and we should probably consider making this our closing comments.
Yeah.
And that is that one, get help. I mean, if you can, if you have the wherewithal to work with a therapist of some kind, even even if it's someone who's an intern and trying to get into the trade of therapy, that can make all the difference. But it's in stages, in these small incremental stages, because that external nervous system is capable of doing such great things to bring us out of the narrative. This will come up a lot in our future conversations. The narrative that we talk about ourselves. Because my narrative had a lot to do with my sense of my value as it pertained to whether or not I could contribute some utilitarian or commodity, function. And I went around a lot really feeling like I was worthless all the time if I wasn't producing my idea of, the right number of widgets or the right number of hours worked or something like that.
Yeah.
The success story that I will talk about more in the future as we're beginning to wind this down is that, so I work at a university. You got to be social to work at a university. This is not a place to be a hermit. And that's pretty good. So my social life was at least enriched by the place that I worked. But then there are these other things about that, which is it's not just that you have a social circle at work, because that's easy to turn off and go home and hide in the dark. Yeah, there's other things like there's clubs that we can be a part of outside of our vocational life. Of course, if you're a church going person, pretty good place to keep a social life alive as well. There's Toastmasters. I can't speak highly enough of the Toastmaster group I was in. It's a great place for us to cultivate a skill set way beyond that we had in the military. There's a speaking track and a leadership track, and these are both things that veterans already have some experience with. And then the final thing I'll mention is that at the kind of extreme end of really pushing back against the trend of isolation is that I took up ballroom dancing in 2021. Of all people, me, this guy right here. You ask anybody who knows me, they would tell you that's not a thing Richard does. He's not a dancer. And I would agree, I'm not. Ask anybody whose feet I stepped on last night. But what I want to mention about this, and I'll elaborate quite a bit more in the future, is that the enterprise of dancing is nearly the perfect solution for acquiring human interaction. And in the studio that I dance at, extraordinarily positive and reaffirming human interaction.
Yeah.
You can't help but be on your best behavior while you're there. And when you're learning a step, doesn't matter which one it is, because it turns out they're all just variations on each other. You got these people who want you to come back. I'm paying for lessons, so they don't want to scare me away. So they're awfully nice to me. And the story goes on and on with regard to this, which is that, well, as a result of having learning this skill of dancing, I'm getting in connection with my body. I'm getting in connection with the experiences of um, body sensations and motion and movement, and it's it's created all the scenarios that we would idealize as a means of recovery from trauma. It's creating interpersonal connections. It's affirmative and it's supportive, and it does this thing that is not just key to dance, it's key to anything new that you learn. It puts your brain into the beginner's mindset, which is where we create the most growth. It's literally neurogenesis. It's literally how we grow new brain tissue. And it's things like that that isolation destroys.
Yeah.
Isolation calcifies our brains, and it makes us susceptible to disease states that are, well, they have an endpoint, and it's tragic. So we talked today about the idea of isolation in the veteran population, in the veteran community. And I talked about some of the neurobiology that is attendant to that, and some of the neurobiology that's a consequence of trauma. this is not the last time we'll talk about this, and it's not the last time that we'll get a chance to have a forum for exploring more and more of the topic and specificity of those regions of the brain that we talked about, and allopathic stasis or allopathic load, which is what stress is. So on that note, I think we should probably make our
And
exit to the door.
yeah, so I did write an outro. So really thank you, Richard, for going in depth on that. And
Yeah.
I have well, we could talk for another hour, and I'm sure we will next week. So I'll just say if you like what we're doing, I know we didn't even get to go to the pseudoscience conversation, so that's good. We'll have plenty of things to talk about, and I'm sure they'll just multiply abundantly. So if you like what we're doing, leave a like, a comment, a subscribe. We appreciate your feedback, and we're open to topics of discussion. Use the YouTube comments to respond, I guess, at this point until we get more social media apparatus up and working and functioning. So,
Say about that.